Well, folks, welcome to the Nobleman Podcast. I am so thankful to have Professor Nancy Pearcey with us, and we've already chit-chatted a little bit. I know there's a thunderstorm going on where you are in Houston, so we're just going to pray that the Lord keeps that away. But welcome to the Nobleman Podcast, Professor Pearcey. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. And by the way, I love that title, The Nobleman.
Well, thank you. And so I've told you a little bit about this. Noble Warriors may be unique in terms of some of your podcast interviews because our focus is helping churches disciple men. And so I am so thankful for this book. It has already been a landmark book. I've shared it with a number of pastors. I've talked about it. I've given it away to some folks. I was listening to a sermon from a pastor in California yesterday, and he mentioned your book on his sermon in September, the Labor Day weekend. So, man, you're making some traction. But let's start off with tell us the toxic war on masculinity. Most people talk about toxic masculinity, and you talk about the toxic war. So tell us about the title and the differentiation between those two ideas.
Right. Well, you have to use the words toxic and masculinity because that is the phrase. But I didn't want to use that actual phrase because I do not think masculinity is toxic. And so I was trying to figure out, what was a way to get both words in there without, committing myself to the idea that there is such a thing as toxic masculinity. And so it really was kind of a play on words. That I hope maybe would cause people to do sort of a double take, right? And most people say that it did do that. A lot of people misread it the first time. They did read it as the war on toxic masculinity and had to go back and say, wait, what? So I hope it serves its purpose in terms of attracting attention and showing, of course, that I am going to have a very different message.
Awesome. Well, so you say that you don't believe masculinity is toxic. I agree with you. I think masculinity is God's design. I think sin is toxic. So tell us about the war on masculinity being toxic and how that got to be so damaging and dangerous.
Oh, yeah. So I have to tell you, I started to write this book because I did notice how socially acceptable it has become to express incredible hostility against men. One of the articles that caught my eye was in the Washington Post, and it was titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And I thought, really? In a mainstream publication? A Huffington Post editor tweeted hashtag kill all men.
Wow.
And you can buy t-shirts that say, so many men, so little ammunition. And even books with titles as blunt as I Hate Men and No Good Men and Are Men Necessary? So that's what caught my eye. And by the way, even some men are jumping on the bandwagon. So there's a fairly well-known male author who wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. I just can't believe people talk this way. And you may have seen the most recent one. It's not in the book because it was in the news recently, but, the director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, was quoted saying, testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So this is what got my attention, and I thought, we've got to get to the bottom of this. I write mostly apologetics books, and I consider this apologetics because what I'm doing is I want to get to the bottom of why secular culture gets masculinity so wrong, and then, of course, defend a biblical view of masculinity.
Well, secular culture is getting this wrong because they are, according to some of your research, they're lumping everyone who checks the box for Christian in one camp. And you've pointed out that there is a differentiation. There really two different groups of men who might check that box. And so we get this bifurcation, maybe even a barbell sort of graph. So explain the difference between these two groups and how that can cause confusion in our culture.
Right. So many people consider evangelical Christian men exhibit A of toxic masculinity. Right. It was really easy to find examples, but I'll give you just one. So the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement, said this: the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. And so what happened is the social scientists were reading these kinds of accusations and saying, "Where's your evidence? You're making these charges. Where's your data?
Right.
And so they went and did the studies, psychologists, sociologists, and I cite roughly a dozen or so studies where they said, actually, the media narrative has it all wrong. It turns out that committed Christian evangelical men who attend church regularly test out the best. They test out as the most loving husbands and fathers of any group in America. And by the way, they interview the wives separately, because I often get people saying, well, of course, their wives said that, the husband's sitting right next to them. No, actually, right. Most of these studies were taken from these large objective databases. The largest one is called the General Social Survey, and it's done by the University of Chicago. And it's a database that policymakers and journalists and politicians, social scientists all draw from. So the women are in fact interviewed separately. And so what they're saying is the wives report the highest level of happiness with their husband's expression of love and affection. Evangelical fathers spend more time than any other group with their children, both in terms of shared activities like sports, church youth group, and in terms of discipline like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Right. Evangelical couples have the lowest rate of divorce. They are 35% less likely to divorce than secular people. And then the real stunner is they actually have the lowest level of domestic abuse and violence. And so the studies have completely debunked the media narrative. And even Christians don't know this. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this. And let me give you just one quote, because sometimes a quote can really crystallize it. This is one of my favorite, my go-to sociologist, I call him. He's also one of the best-known, most famous marriage sociologists in the country. His name is Brad Wilcox. He's at the University of Virginia.
You're right here in Virginia.
Nice. Yeah, UVA.
Yeah.
And he, to give you a sense of his stature, he writes for places like the New York Times. So this is an article from the New York Times that he wrote. And he says, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. And of course, they do focus often on the wives, because the assumption is any sense of male headship turns men into overbearing, oppressive, tyrannical patriarchs. So no, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. And so this isn't just, a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid empirical research. This is evidence-based findings that we should be bringing into our churches to start with, to help churches to support and affirm men who are doing a good job. But we also should bring it into the public square and be bold about saying, you guys have got it all wrong, debunking the secular narrative. And then I often get a pushback by people who say, but haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of society? In fact, in my research, I found that was one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. So what happened, though, is the researchers went back to the data and they separated out, as you said, they separated out the truly committed Christian men, which they defined primarily by attending church regularly, from men who are just nominal Christians. And by the way, my students don't even know what the word nominal means, so I have to explain. NOM is Latin for name, so it means in name only. So these are men who might, in a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, for example, but they don't actually attend church. It's mostly cultural background, family background. And these men test out shockingly differently. They fit all of the toxic stereotypes. So their wives report the lowest level of happiness with their husband's treatment of them. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They divorce at a higher rate than secular men, 20% higher than the secular culture.
Wow.
And then the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America. So this is where the stereotypes, or really the statistics, get skewed, because if you just study evangelicals, you're going to get men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. And so, of course, the numbers are going to be misleading. And so this was incredibly helpful. Brad Wilcox was the one who did the largest study. So if you want to follow up, that's your sociologist to go to. Well, let me give you a quote. One more.
Sure.
This is actually my favorite one because Brad Wilcox turns to his fellow academicians, right? Most sociologists, it's a highly secularized field. And he turns to them and he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So Christianity really does have the ability to reconcile the sexes, as I put it in the subtitle of my book.
So with that in mind, I don't know that you get into this, but what makes the difference in the lives of those evangelical men? I mean, you said the measure is they go to church consistently, but is there something more than showing up and sitting in a pew on Sunday morning that makes a difference in the lives of these evangelical men?
Well, two answers to that. Surprisingly, church attendance tends to correlate pretty closely with a deep heart commitment. You know, there are studies that have been done trying to tap into, how sincere are they? They'll ask questions like, how often do you pray? Or, how important is your religion? Or do you have a sense of God's presence in your life? There are studies that have done that. And in fact, They haven't found that you get much different output from just asking, do you attend church regularly? And since that is a very empirical, quantifiable measure, they've ended up choosing that as the main measure because it tends to correlate, tends to give you everything you need. So that was surprising because, most of us think, aren't there a lot of people who just sort of show up? But apparently not. Apparently the ones who care enough to show up regularly do in fact have that deeper commitment as well. And the second thing I was going to say is, I often get asked, why would nominal Christians be worse than secular men? I mean, don't they at least have a little bit of Christianity?
Right.
Wouldn't that help them? Well, it turns out that they are taking words like headship and submission, but not giving them the biblical meaning. Instead, they're infusing or importing meanings from the secular script for masculinity. And the difference between that and a secular man is the nominal man feels like he has religious justification. So the run-of-the-mill secular guy who's maybe mistreating, abusing his wife and children, he doesn't feel that he has religious justification. But the nominal Christian does. He thinks he's got, in a sense, religious permission to act like that. And so he ends up actually being worse than a secular man. So that was one of the most surprising findings.
So those guys become tyrants who read Ephesians 5 and force submission instead of reading the next verses and love their wives as Christ loved the church and invite her on this journey of following Jesus together. Is that a fair way to look at that, perhaps?
So I do have a whole chapter of surveys so that I wanted to see what are real, ordinary Christians, how are they living, and what do they think it means to practice headship and submission. I didn't want to hear from the experts, the theologians, the thought leaders, because they can pontificate, they can tell us what they think the Bible means. I wanted to know what real, ordinary Christians do. And the reason for that is the secular argument is, if you believe in any sort of male headship, this will turn you into an overbearing, tyrannical patriarch. Well, does it? The only way you can find out is by asking actual Christian couples. And so I have a chapter that's consists strictly of surveys of Christian couples. And I have to tell you, I was blown away. I was surprised. I did not expect Christian couples to express such a loving, mutual, respectful definition of headship. If I was surprised, I'm sure a lot of my readers are surprised as well. And the most frequently cited Bible verse was Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And the interesting thing about that was I have chapters later on abuse. Since nominal men have high levels of abuse, I had to deal with that, right? Otherwise it would look like I was sweeping it under the carpet. In that chapter, I quote people who said, I never heard any sermons on the second part of Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives, I literally quoted one woman who said, I didn't even know that verse was in the Bible. I had to go look it up myself. They had never heard the part in Ephesians addressed to husbands. They had only heard the part addressed to wives. So that tells you something. When you got to the really committed men, they quote the part to husbands. And so I thought that was pretty cool. And if you ask them, well, what do you think headship means then? Just how are you living it out in your life? They did not say final authority. They did not say tiebreaker. They did not say, I forget some of the other things that we often hear. What they did say was spiritual leader. That was the most widely given definition of what it means to be head. And so then the researchers would say, what does that mean? What do you mean spiritual leader?
Right.
And they started with the practical things, like get your family to church on Sunday, get your kids to youth group, have Bible reading and prayer in family devotions at home. But they often went further than that. They went into the more non-tangible things like, well, I'm responsible for my children's spiritual growth. I'm responsible for my wife's spiritual welfare. It's up to me. Taking the initiative means, I quoted one author who said, male initiative means you go first. You go first. If you want a rich spiritual life in your home, you go first. You make sure you have a rich spiritual life. And so you have something to give. If you want your family to be, more responsible in keeping the house clean, you go first, and then invite them to join you. So it was amazing to me how much evangelical couples communicated a very warm, loving definition of headship.
Well, that's encouraging. But I find it discouraging that some folks had stopped their preaching on Ephesians at the submission part. And so you get the idea that there are some churches out there where this broken picture of what made so toxic, it's toxic right in the church right there in that scenario. I mean, that's probably a bold statement for me to make, but until you tell the whole story of the redemption that comes with Christ, then that's an incomplete message. And I find that frustrating.
Yes, exactly. And, when I do have the chapters on abuse, it's true that committed evangelicals have the lowest rate, but it's not zero. So it is true that even some people who attend church regularly are still having difficulties. In addition to the nominal men. And by the way, of course, the outcome of that studies is that the practical takeaway is we should be. I would like to see churches be more supportive and encouraging to the men who are doing well. Even in Christian circles, men feel the discouragement, the demoralization of a culture that says masculinity is toxic. When I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, a male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us."
Wow.
And then, and another story from my class, I have a graduate student who was the leader of the women's ministry at a large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell the mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. And so I thought, well, I tried very hard not to have a scolding tone in this book because I think the church needs to get past that. The church needs to look at these numbers and say, men, you're doing a good job. And you asked the question of why did church make a difference? And I didn't answer that one. There is an answer, though. So we're back to Brad Wilcox. So the sociologist, because he works in a very secular environment, he finds himself having to explain to his colleagues why church makes a difference. And it's almost comical for you and me because, we do know that church makes a difference.
Right, we get it. But
he has to explain this to people who don't go to church. And even myself, I have a sister who's not a Christian, and she was very skeptical. She said, well, maybe it's a self-selection process. Maybe it's not that church helps men be nice guys. Maybe it's that nice guys choose to go to church. To which I say, well, what is it about church then that would attract nice guys?
Right.
But Brad Wilcox tries to explain to his secular colleagues, well, here's what you need to understand. Men do not get a pro-family, pro-marriage message anywhere else. They don't get it in the workplace. They don't get it at the bar. They don't get it at the sports stadium. But at church, they get a message that tells them you're responsible to God for how you treat your family. You're responsible to God for the, ultimate spiritual welfare of your children. An immortal soul is at stake here in how you treat your children. And then church itself, of course, gives you activities, not just Sunday morning, but, youth groups and, Bible studies during the week, men's groups where they can get together with other men who actually care about their family and want to talk about that. So Brad Wilcox does give us some nice language there for explaining to our non-Christian friends, why church actually does have a positive impact on men. It's the only place you will really get this kind of pro-marriage, pro-family discourse for men.
Well, and I just affirm that because I had a conversation this afternoon on the phone with an older gentleman who is distraught because his children are not walking in the faith, and he is broken over that. He's not sure what to do. And so as in my role in coaching pastors and men's ministry leaders, I tell them the softest spot in a man's heart is for his children. And to find a way to help a man do well with his children and raise up a healthy next generation. We don't want kids to peak in elementary school. The highlight of their experience should not be, I've got a honor roll student at the elementary school, but to see a bigger view of raising godly adults. And so I just so much affirm what you're saying there about the desire for fathers and church being a place where they can get those answers.
And
so thank you for that.
It is the most important long-term solution to toxic behavior in men. Insofar as the secular script has encouraged young men to be like Andrew Tate, right? Fast cars, fast money, fast girls. And by the way, I just heard from a former graduate student of mine who's now teaching high schoolers. And she said, all of our boys are fans of Andrew Tate. They're putting his quotes in the yearbook. She teaches at a classical Christian school. I didn't expect that at a school like that. So young men are seeking out, what does it mean to be a man? And what the sociologists tell us is that, long term, what matters most is the relationship with his father, right? There was a award-winning study, it was a 35-year longitudinal study on how effective parents are at passing along their Christian faith. Right. And they found two things that were surprising. The first surprising thing was if a father is active in his faith, 68% of his children will follow. They will match his level of religious participation. It doesn't work that way with the mother. I don't know if they even gave us, the article I read didn't even give the mothers. I think it was something like 40%. But anyway, fathers, it's 68%. So fathers matter more. And by the way, my female students don't always like hearing that. They say, why shouldn't mothers matter? Well, they matter, but you know what? It's just a fact. It's a fact. Men are leaders whether they want to be or not. Men have...
That's exactly right.
Men have influence whether they want to or not. The second thing he found is how they have influence, though. He said if a man is the pillar of the church, if he's a moral exemplar, if he has perfectly correct theology, but he's not loving, his children will not follow him in the faith. It takes a warm, loving relationship. That is the most important thing. And I was surprised, even secular researchers found something similar. There was a science journalist who wrote a book on boys. And he said, the masculinity of the son does not depend on how masculine the father is. It depends on whether he has a warm, loving relationship with his father. That will make a boy more masculine. So
I was surprised to read that in your book. I found that fascinating. I think you also cited a study that I'm familiar with. I want to say it's a National Center for Fathering or the National Fatherhood Initiative that asked mothers where could the father of their children go to get help with being a better dad. The number one answer was the local church. But most churches are not doing anything of remarkable impact in the area of fathering. And so I just think that's a missed opportunity for a lot of churches.
Isn't that, I agree with you. And what was interesting about that study, and yes, you're right, National Fatherhood Initiative, is that even women who said they were not very religious or not at all religious, they still said the best place is the local church. And then they asked the fathers a slightly different question. They asked them, where have you gone to find help being a better dad? And about 50% of the fathers said the local church. So you're right. I like the way you put it. That's a missed opportunity. If churches aren't stepping up and doing more to nurture fathers, nurture biblical fathers. And I say this too in the book. I think there's an important role for the churches to deal with fatherless children. I keep running into this number. 40% of American children are growing up apart from their natural fathers and often don't see them at all. So, and some of them are lucky enough to have father substitutes in the home, but not most of them. America has the highest rate of single parenthood in the world. And so one thing I say in the book is, by the way, I just got quoted in Christianity Today for this. There's an article that said, Nancy Pearcey says that churches should put a higher priority on ministries to fatherless boys. And then the author said, she's absolutely right. But I make a point in the book that fatherless boys, I mean, if you care about, toxic masculinity or toxic forms of it, the answer is not to go out and accuse men of being toxic. The answer is to start nurturing the next generation. And the good news is that there's been research on this, and research has found that father substitutes can have a huge impact at grandparents and other extended family, teachers, coaches, Big Brother programs, and of course, church youth group leaders. They can have a huge impact. And so it's not something that anyone needs to stand by idly and say, I can't do anything. You can step in and have an impact. Just about anybody can have an impact in helping to solve this, the boy crisis, as it's sometimes called.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, in my role, I've been engaged with a number of national ministries that their fatherless boys is their target. And so I'm excited to share your book with those leaders and encourage them to pay attention to what you're saying in that research. Let me take this even further in digging into the challenge and the desire, the hunger to understand manhood. So I know you've got a couple of sons. We've got 3 sons. My wife and I have 3 sons and a daughter. All 3 of our boys have been to public universities. And so they grew up, I mean, they were kind of, just grew up in this stew of biblical manhood and me as a men's ministry leader. So they get some things that their peers have not had exposure to. But in their secular schools, the young men around them are hungry to have some idea of what manhood should look like. And so it has become a tremendous opportunity for them to engage conversations because there's a hunger to figure out, what does good and godly manhood look like? How do I grow up to be a good man? Which gives me a segue for you into the study that you reported, where this dichotomy of 2 views of manhood that folks wrestle with. So tell a little bit about that, and I'll share another thought on that as well.
Yeah, I really like this study. So I'll give you a little background that's not in the book.
Sure.
It has proven to be the most controversial book I've ever written. And that surprised me, because my last book was Love Thy Body, which is on abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, which is really exploding today. But this was more controversial. So I did classes on it. I did reading groups on it. And because I like to get a lot of feedback, rub off the rough edges. But they would tell their family and friends. And so people who had not actually read it were only getting it secondhand. The first question they always asked was, whose side is she on? With that tone.
Wow.
Whose side is she on? And men tended to just assume a book on men written by a woman. She was a male-bashing feminist. And more progressive people tend to assume I was some sort of defensive, angry reactionary. And so I put this study right at the front in order to say, look, you don't have to be either for or against. You can be for what's good, and you can critique what's bad. So this study was done by a sociologist who is not a Christian. he gets invited to speak all around the world. And so he came up with this really clever experiment. He would ask young men 2 questions. First, he would ask, what does it mean to be a good man? Right? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man. What does that mean? And the sociologists said all around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately say duty, honor, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy. I kind of like that one. Be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And the sociologists would ask, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, well, I don't know, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with the second question, and he would say, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young man would say, oh no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up. What else? Be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language, of course. And so the sociologist concludes, this is so interesting that young men do seem to be caught between 2 competing scripts. That on the one hand, they innately know what it means to be a good man. You and I would say they are made in God's image. And so they do know what it means. Or you could also maybe say it's part of general revelation. You know, what people can know apart from the Bible. You know, God's truth that can be known to everyone. And on the other hand, they feel this cultural pressure in many places to be the real man. Those are the traits that most of us might consider more toxic, especially if decoupled from a moral ideal. And it suggests a way that we can deal with these issues, by the way, too. Instead of accusing men of being toxic, which most men don't respond very well to, surprise, surprise, can we tap into their inherent knowledge of what it means to be the good man? Romans 2 as well, right? We all have a conscience. Can we tap into and encourage what they already know? And like you were saying, they aspire to be a good man. And then help them to think critically more about the secular script that's out there. The Andrew Tate script, that, help them to think through, which one do they really aspire to be? Because I do think that I totally agree with you. I think most men do aspire to be the good man. They often just haven't been equipped, they haven't been trained, they haven't been taught. And there's actually a book, you'd love this book. There's a book with the title, Good Men, it's called When Good Men Behave Badly. And he was acknowledging most men are good men, even when they're behaving badly. So I think that's what we see a lot of.
Well, I think we take some of those things that can allow men that you can find in both those categories, like risk tolerance. So young men are likely to take risk. And are they going to take risks that just are destructive, or are they going to take risks that are constructive? And so how is that challenged, or how is it channeled? Actually, after reading your book, I had an audience with some seminary students. And so I did that exercise. And they were able to come up with the same sorts of categories. Now, these are guys that feel called to ministry, and they're there for a purpose, but they still could give this list of things that what the culture would say a real man would look like, and then what a good man would look like. And here's one of the interesting the things that precipitated out of that. You can have the things that are listed in the real man category at almost any moment. I mean, you could get rich, you could get laid, you could get a fast car, you could do a lot of those things. But the character that comes with being a good man takes time to develop, and you have to be disciplined and have patience. And then the things that speak to being a real man may bring happiness, but the things that speak to being a good man can bring joy. And so young men get caught between, I can have this now, or I can wait and work and I can have this. And our culture short sells us on the easy, quick reward rather than the long-term benefit, really an eternal perspective on what good and godly manhood looks like. Does that make sense and resonate with you?
Yeah, totally. The Institute for Family Studies does a lot of studies, and I got a lot of my research through them, but they just posted an article, a study showing that married men with children are the happiest. You have single men, single fathers with children, married men, and married men with children. And the curve went up and up and up, showing that married men with children are happiest. And I think it is counter to the cultural messages that a lot of young men get. In fact, I saw this on Twitter just yesterday, and I'm sure it's from some guy who's on the manosphere, because he was saying to be a high quality, high value male, be single, be rich, have a good car. One thing after another, but it started with no kids, no marriage. And I thought, okay, that's the message that they're sending, to be, again, it's a shorthand now, but the Andrew Tate form of masculinity. Let me give you one more positive study, because the more encouragement we get, the better. So this was a study. It was the first ever study done of cross-cultural concepts of masculinity, and done by an anthropologist, not a Christian. And what was interesting about it was he found that no matter how they differed in their definition of masculinity, because some cultures, were more warlike, some were more peaceful, whatever. But all of them shared the ideal that the good man performs what he called the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate. Become a father. Yeah. Build into the next generation. And I thought that was so cool, because it was another confirmation. Again, it was global. So these aren't only nations with a Christian background. It is inherent in men that they know that their unique masculine strengths, because they are stronger than women, they're stronger, larger, faster. And as you mentioned, because of testosterone, they're more aggressive, they're more risk-taking. And we need to affirm those as good. This is the basic equipment that God has given them. And we need to affirm those as good. But what the study showed is men intrinsically know that those special strengths were not given them just to get whatever they want, but given them to provide for and protect and take care of the people that they love. And again, I find that just so encouraging that men have that innate sense. And our goal is to tap into it, help them to recognize that is the true fulfillment.
Right. That's the general revelation again it's God's, it's the Imago Dei in them that believes that there is a purpose in what I'm doing, and I can relate to God the Father through this. One of the things that I find fascinating, and I don't know that you covered this in the book, but I'm seeing more and more progressive women especially ask the question, where do I find a man to marry? Because they champion all of these ideals of what we might consider a soft man, someone who's, kind of warm and fuzzy or whatever. But when it comes down to it, they want to affirm those things. But then there was one viral video where this girl said, well, I want someone who's going to pay for my dinner, who's going to open the door for me, but I don't want him to be a conservative. And she ended by saying, am I asking too much? Am I trying to have my cake and eat it too? And the answer is yes. And then I'll throw one more thing out. The other piece that I'm reading in some of these articles and posts is they have all of these ideals until they have a son, and they begin to ask, how do I raise a son that is going to be potentially a good father or a good provider or a good protector? And so they are running, in many cases, into this roadblock that says, yeah, I believe all these things, but there's this problem. So are you seeing that challenge in front of you, and as people talk about these issues?
Well, one of the ones that's most clear is that more women than men are going to college now. Mm-hmm. The average college is now 60% female, 40% male. And smaller private colleges are worse often. When I first started here at Houston Christian University, it was 70-30, 70% female. Wow. And to push back on that, we started a football team and we started an engineering department to try to bring better balance. But what it means is, and again, this was an article I saw just, I think it was today on Twitter. On Twitter, things go by so quickly you forget when you saw it.
Right.
But there was an article very recently on Twitter that was saying, where are women going to find men, especially college-educated women? Because, of course, they want somebody who's kind of on their level in terms of education, in terms of income, in terms of culture, and so on. And they're not finding them anymore. So
that's right.
This is a problem that I wouldn't say that women have created it, but it goes all the way back to kindergarten, right? Boys are falling behind at all levels. It's not. I started with college because we were talking about finding a mate,
right?
But really, it goes back to kindergarten. Boys are falling behind at all levels of education. Even in kindergarten, they don't have the fine motor controls to handle the scissors. And so already in kindergarten, they're feeling like, I'm dumber. I'm dumber than my female classmates. And it goes all the way up through, all through high school. Girls are more likely to get good grades, more likely to be president of the extracurricular clubs, and so on. And it started because of, Title IX, for one thing, and then the 1994 Gender Equity Act, which poured millions of dollars into helping girls, into equity workshops and training materials and curriculum and so on. And in one sense, that's great. We're not sounding like we think it's bad for girls to get ahead. It's great they're getting ahead. But it's just that there's been nothing comparable for boys. Like right now, depending on what you read, there's 4 or more times. I saw one article saying 4 times as many scholarships for women as for men. Right. I saw another article that said it was 10 times. So I'm not sure which one is correct, but there are a lot more scholarships for women than for men. And we have, girls are getting affirmation and support, and boys aren't. And if you try to implement a program for boys, it gets shut down. The first person to write on this was Christina Hoff Sommers. You might know her book. It was called The War. The War on Boys. And she reports that when they tried to have any kind of programs to help boys, anything targeted for boys was quickly shut down by feminist organizations. And so they've had a terrible time trying to get anything for boys. Have you seen the most recent book is Richard Reeves. He's at the Brookings Institution, and it's called Of Boys and Men. And so it's the latest attempt to say, can't we please have some programs that are targeted for boys? We need to have compassion on these boys. We need to give them we need to equip them. If you want boys to grow up into healthy, respectful, high achieving men, you've got to give them the tools. And we're not doing that at this point.
Well, and our culture is going to continue to suffer for that. And we're seeing the ramifications of it. I tell you, as you talk about the education thing, part of what echoes in my mind is sadness about the fact that we in the church are doing very similar things with not working to raise up young boys or to teach young boys. I mean, we're using some of the very same pedagogy strategies in church environments that we're using in school environments, and boys are. I mean, what's there for the little boy that likes to play differently, and where are the men who are working with little boys? And so we end up with some of those challenges as well. The church has kind of fallen into that same pattern that we could work on. Yes.
The average U.S. congregation is 60% women, 40% men.
Right.
So again, with all that, with so many women running the Sunday school classes and running the nursery and so on, boys are not being mentored by men to a large extent, even at church. And so that's why people talk about the feminization of the church. And it's been that way, by the way. It's been that way since the early church. And the church fathers talk about how already back then there were more women than men. But it was for a different reason, I think. Back then it was because the Roman culture had such a low view of women.
Church was a safe place for women.
It was a safe place. And they had much more stature, much more dignity in the church. The Roman culture was very negative toward women, right? They thought they were very inferior. Abortion and infanticide was practiced mostly against baby girls. It was very rare for a Roman family to have more than one token daughter. And then, of course, the sexual ethic. If you if you want to call it an ethic, that Roman men were expected to have sex with just about anyone, and that's completely socially acceptable. Prostitutes and courtesans and mistresses, but most of all slaves. Your slaves were fair game. By the way, both women and men, because homosexuality was rampant, both adults and children. So yes, a woman who became a Christian, in the Christian world, she didn't have to compete with all those other people for her husband's love.
Right.
When I was writing my earlier book, Love Thy Body, I actually read a Roman writer writing to a married woman and admonishing her not to be jealous when her husband had sex with a slave boy. And he said, because we all know that sex with boys is more pleasurable. So that's what Roman women were up against. You can see why they flocked to the Christian church. So it's been that way from the beginning. But these days, I do think that we need to talk about how to make our churches more friendly to men. There's a book called, have you seen the book, Why Men Hate Going to Church?
Why Men Hate Going to a Church. Yeah, David Murrow is a friend. So,
good.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and his website, Church for Men, has a lot of sort of simple, basic things that churches can do to make the church, starting with the decor, make it more manly, don't have pastels, get rid of the Kleenex boxes at the end of the pew. They're very practical, and it works. A lot of his suggestions, I think, work in attracting men on at least the superficial level. Why not start there?
We talk about the patriarchy, and the term patriarchy is just completely maligned these days. There's almost no context in which it seems to be used in a positive light. But Dennis Rainey from Family Life lists the patriarchy as the highest level of achievement for a man when he reaches a point where he is caring for, loving, and praying over his children, his grandchildren, and he gets to love them. It seems like a wonderful godly representation of mature manhood. So can we redeem patriarchy? Is it just completely shot? I mean, what does biblical patriarchy look like in today's times?
Well, history is great because it gives us alternatives. And so in the book, I do go back to the colonial era. That's America still. Right. That's not biblical times, so it's a little closer in history. But in the colonial era, pre-industrial age, men worked all day alongside their wives and children on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural ethos for manhood was very much of a caretaking role, responsibility for their family. In fact, the very word authority had a very specific meaning at the time. What it meant was that authority was the person responsible for the common good. In other words, I look out for what's good for me, you look out for what's good for you, but who looks out for the common good of the marriage itself, or the family itself, or the church, or the civil society? And that's what the person in authority was to do. He was to be disinterested, a word we don't understand too much anymore today, but what that means is he's not to look out for his own interest. He was the one who was supposed to selflessly look out for the good of the whole. And we've kind of lost that. In fact, you'll love this. The literature on parenting in the colonial era was addressed to fathers, not to women, not to mothers. Like if you go to a bookstore today, most of the books are written to mothers. But back then, they really thought the father was the primary parent. And they were especially important
there were no mommy bloggers back then?
Mommy bloggers. I love the idea that, they were holding fathers responsible for their family. Oh, and this too, not only were they responsible for their families, but a common phrase back then was that they were held responsible for being fathers of the community. That was a word at the time as well. In other words, they were supposed to bring their fathering out into the community and have that. The good meaning of the word patriarchy is that I'm bringing a fatherly tone into my interaction even outside the home. And how did we lose that? Well, we did lose it with the Industrial Revolution because it took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home. And for the first time, they were not working alongside the family members, people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's when the language started to change. That's when people at the time began to say men are losing their caretaking ethos. They're becoming egocentric, self-centered, greedy, ambitious, acquisitive, look out for number one, make it at all costs. That kind of language starts to permeate the literature. I mean, people were protesting. They didn't like what they were seeing.
Right.
But that's what the first time you see negative language applied to the masculine character. And what I do in the book then is I show how the secular script developed over time. So, because I want us to be able to say, where did it, you can't stand against a social trend unless you know where did it come from and how did it develop. And so a lot of the book.
Exactly. And I appreciated so much the arc of history that you drew with starting in the colonial era, going through Industrial Revolution, and then talking about the abolitionists and oh my goodness, trying to get rid of alcohol. What was that called? That's
temperance movement.
Temperance movements, and then muscular Christianity. I mean, men have behaved badly, and the church has tried to respond to that in different ways. And so reading that historical arc was enlightening. And that's worth the book itself, just getting a picture, historical background of how we got to where we are is valuable. So, let me ask you one more question that gets a little personal, and then we'll finish this up. You open the book by talking about your two dads, and you say, I had a public dad who I'm just going to use my terms, was squared away and respected, and he made sure that his family got to church, and he was an upstanding man in the community. But behind closed doors, he became a different guy, abusive, hateful even, and dangerous. I mean, he became a toxic guy. And so I wonder, Patrick Morley talks about a holy moment when a dad reaches for the door on the local church and opens it to take his family into the church. I don't know if you know Patrick Morley,
just the name,
writer of Man in the Mirror. But he talks about that holy moment. And I just wonder, I know your dad was taking you guys to church. What could the church do for a man like Nancy Pearcey's dad? How do we get into a space where we can help a man and help a family? Because there are families out there suffering like you and your siblings did. I know that's happening. How can the church helpfully respond to that? And I hope that's not too personal to press in on here.
Well, I wrote about it, so I better be ready to talk about it, right? I did grow up in a very abusive home. Books on abuse will sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist. Yeah. And in fact, he made a knuckle fist like that for a sharper stab of pain. But he was very careful to always hit us where it would not make visible bruises. So never in the face, right? Always under the clothes. So we'd have bruises under the clothes. And so that's why nobody knew, right? Because it wasn't showing. We weren't coming to school with black eyes and so on. Looking back, I realized, he was being very careful.
Right.
Let me answer first in terms of how I got healing, because a Christian psychologist interviewed me and he said, when I first opened your book and read that story, I thought, oh no, and an abused woman, she's going to be angry at men. And then he said, actually, no, the book is very supportive, and very positive. Yes. But that's because I got healing early on in my Christian life. The story of my conversion, which I won't go into all the way here, but it was through L'Abri, which was the ministry of Francis Schaeffer. And he's known mostly for his apologetics ministry. And of course, that's what, got me first. I had a lot of intellectual questions. I'd absorbed a lot of secular isms. I'd never met Christians who could engage with those secular isms. And so I was blown away. I was very impressed. But also, and that is how I became a Christian. But on staff at L'Abri was a psychiatric social worker. Her name was Sheila Bird, and we called her Birdie. And I don't usually add this detail, but I'll add it for you. So the reason I went to L'Abri, people say, why did you go to a Christian ministry if you weren't a Christian? I went to L'Abri because my family was traveling across Europe to get to the cheap Luxembourg flights. My dad had been teaching in the Middle East, and without going into detail, and somebody told him, well, if you're driving across Europe, you should stop at this Christian place called L'Abri. And my father, so they were sort of the first touristy Christians to go to L'Abri. But here's the deal. So I came down to L'Abri to see my family. I didn't go there to go to a Christian place. I went there because my family said, hey, we're stopping at this place, and come down and see us. And so the upshot of that is that Bertie, the psychiatric social worker, saw my father. He actually saw my father. And she told me later, I looked at your father and I thought, there is a man who oppresses everyone around him. So she could see it. And of course, then she knew what to talk to me about. When I came to see her and talk with her, she said she zeroed in on my relationship with my father. But I thought that was fascinating. Now, what if, to answer your question, what if churches could do that? What if nobody spotted my father? Nobody else did that I know of, at least.
Right.
But Bertie spotted it. She could see, even in his demeanor, that he was a harsh, overbearing person. And by the way, she watched the rest of our family too and saw that there was no cohesion, there was no relationships. When you're growing up in an abusive home, it filters down to, poor relationships in the whole family. And she saw all of that just watching us for an evening. So what about that? I would love it if churches could have, enough to train people, even part-time on staff, to deal with abuse. In the chapters on abuse at the end of the book, I do say it's probably time for churches to start having some kind of specialized staff, even if you can't afford full-time, to help with abuse issues, because it's too much to ask for pastors, right? I mean, pastors haven't... Absolutely. they have enough on their plate, and they're not trained this way. But a few trained people could go a long way, maybe, in helping to spot it and to begin to minister to those families.
And I think one of the things that's one of the unicorns in the Christian world is a male counselor. And that's really hard to find. There are very few of them around here in our area, but to find a counselor that men would feel comfortable speaking with, I think is very valuable. So I'm loving when I can find a guide that I trust to send other men to unpack, because there's often trauma. I mean, there is often a reason why these guys have they're toxic, and so we've got to unravel the knot and get back to that. So,
yeah, absolutely. I think almost always there's a father wound or some other trauma in the background, and the tricky thing is to recognize that, but still not let them off the hook. I understand you have these issues. That doesn't mean you can hit your wife, or your kids.
That's right. I mean, we can't condone sin. We can't condone bad behavior. And so we do want to move these men to the healthy, evangelical, wife-loving, kid-raising, godly men. The 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1 men that Paul identifies for Timothy and Titus. Well, listen, you've been so generous with your time, and I have enjoyed this conversation. I feel like we could go on and on. I do want to tell folks, buy this book. Mine is so marked up that I probably need another one. I've just got so many notes. I enjoyed it. It has become a landmark tool in my ministry to men through local churches. And so I'll hold up my copy of it. I'll just push it out there. And so, Nancy, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the work and the energy that you've invested in this, and for the impact it's going to have on the kingdom. We just give God glory for that.
So, thank you. Thank you. And it really is quite an honor to me to talk with someone whose ministry focuses on men. I really appreciate the work you're doing. I hope I talk to a lot more men's ministries, because what you're doing is just so valuable.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Folks, check out nancypearcey.com, I think is the website, so you can read about all of our other books. And this particular book, get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold. I think you can order it on the website as well. But folks, we want you to get this type of information, because if you're investing in men in any way, the insights that Nancy unpacks in this book are going to be useful to you as you help to disciple men. So check that out. Nancy Pearcey, thank you so much for being with us. This has been a blessing today.
Thanks for having me. I do appreciate it.